How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I have got a very special guest for you. Today, I'm joined by the co-founder of Acu Mobility. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Brad Cox. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. How are you? What's been happening in your world recently?
Oh my God, what has been happening in our world? We're doing great. Things are busy as usual. Got a lot of things in the works, new products we're working on, new education ideas, and things that we're looking to launch in the coming year.
Oh, nice. And I know obviously, people listening and people might be sick of me mentioning about it, but especially with how the last 2 years has been with gyms closing, reopening, things kind of getting back to normal. A lot of people have mentioned that it gave them an opportunity to work on other areas or other projects, education or coaching, or sometimes just content. How have you found the last couple of years? Has it affected things or allowed you to put energies into other projects? How has everything been going from sort of that end?
The main thing that would change is that all of the in-person stuff we were doing clearly took a pause. And so prior to COVID, we were traveling a lot, teaching, different seminars, teaching the one-day courses on how to assess and fix movement, doing workshops, trade shows. There was just a lot more of that. And then that just kind of all paused. So it just went more digital. And that's been really the main shift, I'd say, is that, just focusing on producing content that way and educating people that way.
Yeah.
And I look forward at some point to hopefully getting back to being able to do at least some things in person.
Yeah, definitely. And how did you find? Because I know I've done it the last 2 years actually. The Kabuki Education Week, being able to present on online. How did you find that? Do you think there's going to be more concepts like that going forward?
I think that there's 100% going to be more opportunity for things like that. As I'm sure you know, we love the guys over at Kabuki. We've been literally since founding the companies. Chris and I launched the companies at like literally within the same month of each other, and so we've been close friends and partners, and anything they do we support. And the Kabuki Education Week was brilliant in terms of bringing all these people together, doing like targeted subjects. I thought it was a great format. It seemed really popular. It was a lot of fun to do, and so I'm assuming they'll continue something like that. But I also see that there's going to be a lot of opportunity for venues like that. I've noticed a lot of other things go digital, a lot of other conferences and stuff like that. That being said, some of these things you just can't do except for in person. And so I have a feeling you're just going to see a mix going forward, where we'll get back to the in-person stuff, and then it'll be augmented by opportunities like that.
Yeah, definitely. I know for me, being based over in the UK, and for probably maybe a lot of just people interested in strength training or coaches based over in the UK, not always being able to get over to the States or abroad. It was really good, but I know for myself as a coach, I thrive off sort of the in-person, the in-person sort of stuff, and I think sometimes you can bounce ideas a little bit more for the in-person seminars that I've been to, and get a feel for sort of the people who are there. I think sometimes trying to get the questions online, it's hard to see people's reactions sometimes from the seminar, or teach things from there. Now, obviously, I did a little bit of a brief introduction, but for everyone listening who might not know your background, how Acu Mobility came about, just want to give everyone listening a bit of a background to yourself.
Sure. So my wife, Dr. Sonia Pasquale, and I run a sports medicine clinic just northwest of Boston, where we specialize in assessing and rebuilding dysfunctional movement patterns for athletes as well as for average people. But really, we specialize in strength and endurance athletes. That was our kind of sweet spot in terms of breaking down the underlying movement inefficiencies, either to optimize their ability to hit new PRs or to fix orthopedic conditions that they might be having, injuries, stuff like that. And so that was our background. We're going into year 12 of the clinic coming up here. And about 6 years ago, we launched Acu Mobility, the product and education side of the company. out of the clinic, where really our whole emphasis was on taking all the educational components that we learned and developed in the clinic and making it more widely available. And in the process, we developed some really innovative products that we have since patented and launched to help really augment some of the education and do the targeted work that we were trying to teach people how to do. And that's how it evolved. And that's why, our roots are in education, our roots are in fixing, whether it be orthopedic conditions or fixing movement issues. And then the products were in something that got layered onto that because there was nothing that did what we wanted it to do. And my wife had this idea for the ball when we were trying to do different release work. And she saw that, like, oh my God, if this thing didn't roll, look what else we could do. And that led down a road of innovation and just constantly trying to, create new solutions to problems that there wasn't great solutions in the market for. And then we combined the two. So putting together the education and the products. And we got more ideas and more things coming.
Oh, cool. I think that's a good way to go about things, especially is I know for myself thinking, it would be good if it didn't roll. And, some of the products that you've put out there are awesome. Kind of going right back to the beginning though, you mentioned there a lot of things about movement, in terms of strength and endurance athletes. And it's one of those things of, oh, well, if you want to get stronger, you just need to put more weight on the bar. If you want to get fitter, just run a little bit further. But in terms of the movement side of things, what does that kind of cover? I know that's quite a broad topic, but what does the movement and the work that you do cover? And why is it so important to be able to get people out of injury or allow them to get stronger or improve their performance?
So I think this is a good example of where anytime you start talking about movement, right, the tendency in the broader community is to be broad, right, in definition. This is where we get targeted, right? And we go, okay, well, what is the end goal first? And from there, you work backwards into what would be the most efficient and most useful techniques, application of tools to achieve that goal, right? And so it depends on what category we're talking about, because if you're injured, well, that's a totally different assessment and corrective process than if we're really just trying to maximize power output in the squat, right? Like those are two different things. And so in the clinic, clearly we had a large emphasis on fixing orthopedic problems, right? People came in, my shoulder hurts, I did this in my bench, running, my knee hurts, like those classes of things. And with that, we had to do really in-depth, broad assessments that covered every nuance and component of movement. We developed entire plans that incorporated both in clinic treatment work and then a lot of homework. So that's a much more involved process, right? But then there's the kind of whole movement optimization side of things. And for this, I think there's a lot of variability in terms of how you can approach those problems, and also in terms of what is it you're trying to achieve with them. And so you'd have to get really specific, right? So we'd have to talk about certain issues, right? For example, I can't get into position to create the press or like make power in this way. Okay, well then we take that as the problem. That's the goal we're trying to solve, right? Now, we'll just use an example like depth in the squat, something like that, right? And so you go, okay, well, this is the limiting factor. Then the assessments should be really targeted to solving that problem, right? So now you're narrowing down. And that's what we've really tried to communicate is how do you, both as a clinician, but also as just an individual athlete, how do you know in as little time as possible the area that you should be doing the direct work on to improve to reach the goal you're trying to achieve, right? And so that's a very specific thing, and it really depends on, well, what is the goal? Like, what's the problem? And that's kind of where all the fun is.
Yeah,
It's solving the different problems and then communicating to that, right? And you can do it layers, right? There's layers of assessments that you can bring in. There's layers of effort that can be applied, right? You can talk about this just in the warm-up sense. Okay, well, what two things should I really be focused on the warm-up to improve position? And you can talk about it in the bigger sense of, okay, well, how do I develop a plan over months? All of these things use the same tools, but with different emphasis and for a different goal. And I think that's the nuance that is often lost in talking about mobility work and talking about corrective stuff. And I think there's a lot of confusion, and you see different ends of the spectrum where some people are mobilizing for like 2 hours, before working out. And then other people think, oh, this is all a waste of time because it doesn't create long-term. Like, you just got all these wild viewpoints, and all of it's missing the point, which is you need to know what the thing is you're trying to fix. And then you can talk about the most efficient way to do it. We try to bring in some clarity on that and give useful tools to do that. So that would be what I would say in terms of it. It's a big subject. And so if you want to get into specific things, we would want to narrow it down and go, okay, well, this topic, this thing, right? And then we would apply assessments differently for that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is, as a broad topic, movement covers quite a lot of things. And just building on from what you've mentioned there, do you think, because obviously from a coach's point of view, we want to know what is it that we're trying to fix, what is it that we're working on. Do you think sometimes where the confusion comes from the coach's point of view is we're trying to we've got all the foundational movement patterns that everyone needs to do, trying to think about human movement as a whole, and thinking about striking that balance between, okay, well, we need to hit these movements, but then also we need to make sure that they're not in pain, because the movements required for a powerlifter, for example, is going to be slightly different compared to, the amount of overhead stuff that a weightlifter's going to do. Two very similar things, but, it's horses for courses. How much mobility is needed, how much is needed to be focused on. Do you think that's sometimes where coaches can sometimes get the balance wrong in terms of maybe giving people too much movement, or sometimes not enough, or not being specific enough in what they need to work on? Does that kind of make sense?
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that is one of the challenges, that the human body is wildly adaptable, right, to all sorts of stimuli, and can achieve ridiculously variable end ranges of motions and goals and all of this stuff, right? And so that's where you have to get more narrow, because it all works for somebody at some time for some goal. And so it's super confusing because there's just 1,000 options in terms of, well, hit works, and then this works, and then this works, and it all does, right? And that's why arguing about like some of those things makes no sense, in the industry, because I'm like, it goes back to define the goal. What are you trying to do with the guy? Are you trying to make a max PR, right, in this specific range of motion? Cool. Okay, now let's work in that parameter. But we don't have to argue about whether or not that is a better goal than this. And that's where I see the conversation get like a little crazy. And then you introduce too many variables, right? It gets too overwhelming. So for coaches, it's hard because you're having to balance all these different goals, right? Maybe the person wants to lose weight and they want to get like strong, and they want like these sometimes are conflicting goals, right? And then you're dealing with everything that's outside of the gym. And this is the whole other piece of the pie that is just not talked about enough, which is when you talk about the chronic stress that people are under just in life these days, right? The chronic sympathetic dominance that people live in, lack of recovery, overwhelming stimuli, all of these other variables. Well, guess what? That affects how their nervous system is coming into that training. And so, when you take all that into account, you can be easily overwhelmed and go, oh my God, there's too much stuff to work on, right? Like there's 1,000 ways to do this. And that's where getting narrower and getting specific actually can be really useful, right? Defining the goals. Like you just said, okay, if you're an Olympic weightlifter, right, we got certain positional requirements that are because of the demands of where that bar needs to go. They're complementary, but different than if you specialize in kettlebells or if you specialize in powerlifting, right? And so we like to start with that as the goal, right? Powerlifting is straightforward in many ways, right? Because you get like the three main lifts, and then there's individual variation in terms of kind of like the way an individual's body is going to move into those positions is just going to be different, right? Bone lengths and hip socket differences and stuff like that, right? And so once you get that picture of them, that's when you start trying to figure out, okay, so here's their most optimal pathway. What's getting in the way of that, right? Like, can they not brace in the bottom? Do they not have tibial rotation? Do they not know how to do blah, blah, blah? Like whatever it is, now we've got a defined end goal, okay? It's create more power and depth in the squat, right? Now we can work backwards and go, all right, well, what are the few things getting in the way of that? We can get more specific versus trying to solve all of the movement problems that that dude might have, right? Because that is overwhelming.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's kind of, I always use the analogy of it's like a to-do list. If you've got 100 things to do on your to-do list and you've got to do them all in a day, you're going to miss some of it off, or you're going to not be able to do some of them as well as what you need to be. I was actually listening to a podcast as I was driving back from the gym today, and it's kind of, if you were developing a program and they only had a certain amount of time to do it, what's the one thing that you would want to get from that program, from that workout? If you can only choose one thing, it's going to have to be the most important priority, rather than, if you've only got limited time. It's a little bit like, I think in business to talk about what's your elevator pitch. How could you, what would you say in there? You've got to make it to the point. Sometimes if we have longer time, yes, we can add more things in, but ultimately, we have to focus on what the goal is. A couple of things just following up from what you mentioned there. When you mentioned about because everyone's stress is going to vary at certain points, just because sometimes life is going to throw you a little bit of a curveball.
Totally.
Do you think sometimes the movement side of things is, some of it is, I don't want to say like a placebo, but if it just feels good and just they enjoy doing it, let's keep that in there, because if it brings their stress levels down, it might not necessarily be directly related towards their goals, but the stretch that they do or the movement that they do just gets them in the right mindset. And then the other question would be is, when you mentioned about individual technique and difference, again, do you think sometimes from textbooks and from what people are, from what coaches are learning in the education side of things, that coaches try and get clients to certain mobility levels that aren't really necessarily to that person, and try and meet certain standards rather than meeting the person where they're at? Do both of those kind of make? I know there was a lot I said there.
No, both of those I think are really profound points. I think to your first one, when talking about stress, right, and talking about movement is one of the most powerful tools we can use, right, to help with stress. But our relationship with movement is often very culturally defined, right? Where if you're a type A driven person, you're very goal oriented, you're very results oriented. So oftentimes those people that's what they're looking to get out of their movement. And I'm a strong believer in that the vast variety and ways that we can move the body are all good, right? And that we should actually have a little more kind of forgiveness and a little more joy in the process, right? Versus only, right? Like it's how do you hold both, right, at the same time? All right, I want to have a goal, right? I want to achieve this, but to your point, like I feel good doing this. I like doing this. And I think a lot of times we eliminate that too much because we think, oh no, I only have to do the really serious shit, right? Like the stuff that's like, that makes me feel the burn or whatever the idea is, right? And like that becomes too much the focus. And ironically, that often leads to burnout. That leads to dissatisfaction down the road. That leads to all sorts of mental constructs built around movement that maybe in the short run can be positive, but in the long run might end up being challenges. And so I think that like it is something worth playing with and meeting people where they're at and recognizing that, yeah, sometimes like that whole month, well, maybe the goal you set out isn't really the thing that should be the goal, right? And then you think it is, right? This competition or this thing, but maybe that month should be about freaking having fun, just improving your movement quality. And that's okay. Like that's a good thing. And I don't think we give enough permission for that. I don't think we give enough leeway for that. Like individuals are really hard on themselves, like a lot of times. And so I think the coach has an awesome opportunity to play with that. And I think that like the more we do that, the more depth you can find in the movement practice. And also the more you realize that like, at the end of the day, all of these things are just made up, right? Like in terms of like the goals or the things like 26 miles, this is an arbitrary number. Somebody made this up, right? Like this only means something if we make it mean something. And so there's just layers to these journeys when it comes to movement. I think at different phases of life, different months, different weeks, it's okay to recognize that you need something different out of your thing. And I think if we did that, we would avoid a lot of the pitfalls, which are the burnout, drop off pitfalls that you see happen all the time with clients, where like the thing worked for them for 3 months or 6 months, and then something happened in their life, and then they just stopped going to the gym, or they just stopped doing the thing. It's like, well, sometimes if there's a little more forgiveness in there in terms of like how you can change and adapt to that, then they would feel like, oh, okay, I can keep this component in my life. It's an all or nothing equation for a lot of people. And so I think that point that you brought up is like really profound in a way that's beyond just the movement side of things, but like getting into the personal, spiritual, like all of those layers that they're walking into the gym with that person. And coaches, like, they get to see all this stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the one thing I would say about that, is that like every year we go on, we have more and more kind of openness to the vast variety and potential of the human body, and recognizing that all of these rules and all this stuff that we put on it, they're just that. They're just lenses that you look through, and you can change the lens any day, and that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. I think the one thing from there is the being able to one thing I picked up on was having fun with it, and having movement, because especially when I've seen it when clients coming in are so stressed, and you can just see that they're tensed up. And with anything, I know obviously for strength sports, tension is good, but sometimes if we just wanted to move a little bit more and feel a little bit better, just having fun with that movement, being able to play around with it, and that's why in the movement prep and the start of sessions, we'll play around with different body weight movements, just because it's something different. Because I always liken it to when we're at school and we're doing different movements, or we're playing out, same as like the conditioning side of things. Sometimes having games like that, we're ticking off those boxes that we need to tick as coaches or as movement, but it's kind of hidden in a way where we can enjoy it a little bit more, because that's the whole reason why people get involved in any strength sport or running or whatever it is, because we start off enjoying it. And like what you mentioned about the number, whether it's a weight on the bar or a distance, that only becomes more, people take it more serious, whereas actually sometimes it's just a case of, right, okay, what was I doing to get myself to this point where I am hitting PBs or something like that? A lot of it was enjoyment. And if you still enjoy it, you're more likely to, not make mistakes and injure yourself and cause setbacks from it. Just the other part of that then was was coaches trying to fit people to certain standards of movement rather than meeting the person where they're at. What's kind of your take on that? Do you use any sort of movement standards that you would think, right, okay, this is where I need to get this person to? Because I know at the gym that I coach at, we have movement assessments. We've used the FMS. We've used other tests as well. What's kind of your take and your thoughts on that?
So everything that you use when it comes to an assessment is a lens that you get to look through that encapsulates like just a small piece of information for the overall picture, right? And I believe that all of these things should be held loosely in terms of, how do I phrase this? So when we look at, let's take a strength athlete, for example, right? Yes, there is massive individual variation based off of body type, limb length, like all of those things that determine like their most efficient bar path. And with enough research, you can kind of bucket people fairly close, right? In terms of, you could get really deep into the measurements of some of these things to determine like, okay, well, your feet should be more turned out, stuff like that. You can also glean a lot of that from watching them move, right? And this is where it goes to the art side of things. And it's a spectrum, right? You need both. When we do assessments, we do very in-depth, very specific assessments. But the information that we then take from that, we don't hold as like the gospel for like, this is it. And if I don't get them to this 45 degrees of flexion, like it has to be held in a broader context. And I think that tension is one that that interplay between those things is where the expertise of the individual has to come in. right? And I think sometimes people fall further on one side of the spectrum than the other of that, right? They get like super detailed where, oh, this is the research and it says that this exact angle is like the thing. Pretty much every time we've ever found one of that, it gets turned over, right? At some point in the next like few years to decades, right? If you look back the last 30 to 40 years, every like gospel of like, this is the thing and the way, right? That people should move, invariably there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
And if you hold too tightly to that, you can actually be missing stuff right in front of your face, right? So what we try to explain to coaches is that you need to have assessment processes, right, that give you the broad picture, and then you need to get a little more nuance, a little more detail based on that individual to solve the specific problem. And this is where we like, we'll use 10 quick assessments in our level 1 course, for example, that I can glean most of the information I need, right? That's not going to fix all the problems. That's not going to like that doesn't fully like encapsulate, but guess what? It's the starting point, right? And you just kind of pull that thread and you go, okay, so what's the most critical thing? That guy cannot keep his arch fired and he doesn't have good tibial rotation. All right. He's also got 20 other problems, right? That could show up. But in the squat, I know either from experience or from research that if I don't get him to do that thing, these other 20 problems will never resolve themselves. That's what we try to emphasize, is that like, all right, big picture, here's how the guy moves. This is the bar path. This is what like would be the optimal desire for him. Detail down, what's the one thing that we got to start with, right? And I think that's where it comes in, where if you get too attached to your assessment process, you can be running after trying to fix all of the different things that show up in it, and you can actually lose the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of what we try to teach is, okay, with all this information that's coming in, what's the one or two things you start with? Fix those first, man. You'd be shocked. Okay, a lot of times other stuff just improves itself, right? You didn't even do anything purposely for it, right? And there are rules that we have found for that, right? And it depends on the sport, depends on the activity. For example, if we're talking about strength athletes, there is progressions of what's like hierarchy of importance. Then those start with things like, okay, breathing and bracing. Like that's number one. If you suck at that, if you can't use your diaphragm, you can't create intra-abdominal pressure, guess what? You're going to have 20 other problems, right? You're going to have inability to control the motion. You're going to have lack of power. You're going to have mobility issues. You're going to see all that stuff in the guy. But it all comes back to the fact that he can't do that fundamental thing, right? So that's step one. Step two would be ground contact. Can he fire his arch? Can he maintain splay of the foot? Can he have tibial rotation and ankle flexion? If you don't have that, all right, well, now this, in our minds, if you're talking about squat or talking about some of these other things, all right, this is the next like most important thing, and then you work your way up the chain. And so we go, okay, well, when we're assessing all this stuff, if one of those two things is failing first, guess what? That's it. That's what we're going after, right? Unless there's pain or something else that you have to take into the equation, right? Like some very specific thing where you're like, and my elbow hurts. It's like, okay, well then we got to do something about that, right? But if you're talking about movement quality, you start with those two things, right? Fix that first, and then see what of the other 20 things just improve themselves, right? And reassess, assess, you create an intervention, reassess. And if you do that, it's an iterative process versus a defined, like strict process. And that's what we believe. It's detective work. I don't know from the beginning. You put an input into the system and then you go, what changed? Did I get the desired change? Because nothing matters if like none of your freaking ideas matter unless you actually get the change. And that's what we emphasize is, and I know that's it's not the answer that everybody wants, because what people want is they want to just know, like, this is it. Like this assessment process is it. Or this way of squatting is it. And if I just do that, I'm good. God, it's just not true.
Yeah.
I wish it was, it's like there's nuggets and there's good stuff in all of these things.
I think it was an interesting point there that you said, if you hit those one, because it's always, everything can have an effect on something else. So like what you mentioned there, if all of a sudden you work on your breathing and bracing, and then that creates tension, lower down the body, if we still start talking about the squat, other things can fall into place, because it can be like a little bit like I always think of it like a domino effect, that if you get this, sometimes this might fall into place without having, 20 other different things that you're trying to like put 20 fires out, trying to do it all at once. And I think that's the difference between, like what you mentioned there about, we're looking for that one answer, so that when people come in, this is the one assessment that we need to do. This is going to give everybody the answers, and then we just go from there. But I suppose that's the difference between looking at all the information that we've got available, and then I suppose maybe you could call it the art of coaching, or like the term that you used in terms of, the investigating skills, to be like, right, we sometimes need to dig a little bit deeper and, look at that person who's directly in front of us, which makes a lot of sense, because that goes on to sort of one of the other questions that I mentioned when you mentioned about when anything was said that this is the number one thing, this is the gospel thing that we're working towards. It's been proven to be changed, over time, whether it be months or years or anything. And that's maybe the difference between just using, like what we said, just using the research, and then like in the trenches sort of coaching. And from your experience and the amount of time that you've been involved in the coaching and the movement and mobility side of things, is that what you've seen in terms of the biggest change throughout sort of the coaching of movement, that actually it's not a case of we don't need to hit these standards? It's a little bit like, I always use the example, and someone actually mentioned it to me the other week, which I didn't think was a thing anymore, was knees going past toes. Well, yes, your knees can go past, past your toes. It's not a case of we have to be dead rigid from that. So what's the biggest changes that you've seen in terms of movement and mobility, and how that's actually being coached and delivered?
Oh my God. I mean, that just depends on what pocket and niche of the internet world you're talking about, right? People hold some really strong and interesting views that they're very dogmatic about, right? And we espouse there's a great phrase, is, it's a loosely held beliefs, but essentially, like, but you just constantly testing, right? Like these things. And so the research aspect of things can be very confusing for people. And I think that it is one of the mental traps that people often fall into, is that they claim they're research based practitioners or whatever it is. And normally I find this happens with people who are recent grads, people who are like new to the field, and they get really held up on like, oh, well, this research paper is this. Yet again, whether you're talking about how research papers are designed, how they're looking at, whether that reflects the population you're working with, like there's just so much more that's not going to be encapsulated in that if you hold that, and then what's happening in front of you is conflicting that. I see a lot of times people get stuck on the thing. It's like, yeah, but like literally in front of you, you're watching this thing happen, and you're discounting that because some paper didn't agree with it. Doesn't make any sense. And you see this happen all the time. And this is where I'm like, you got to take all these things into account, but then also recognize that without fail, these viewpoints are probably going to change. And part of the reason for that is that the human body is wildly adaptable, right? And can handle all sorts of things that, like, whether it be a certain population might not be able to do, or the guy is undertrained and can't do, doesn't mean it's not achievable. And this is what you see all the time. The knee over toe things is fascinating, right? Like, in what world did we ever think that like a human being in the world would not be able to have their knees track over their toes? And that was like a dangerous position to be in, right? But that was like gospel. That was like held belief. Don't load that, like super bad, right? And then it's like, but how did that even come about? Well, that came about with some really narrow research and some really narrow stuff. Then they got widely distributed and then like held as like, this is it. And you see this happen all the time. And that's just like a good example of it. And yet again, the human body has massive adaptability to positions. Just look at gymnasts. Just look at some of these people who like, look at indigenous people. Look at like the massive variety of human movement potential, which goes back to the beginning of our conversation. If you're going to have any conversation about tools, assessments, or use, you have to define what the end goal is first. Then you can argue about certain things, right? And most of the time, even then, there's 20 ways to fix that problem, right? And this is my other problem with stuff, is that people get too attached to like, well, this way is the only way that works. It's like, no, no, that's not true. It is a way that works. It does not mean that other ways don't. And this comes to like mobility work, right? And I think that like this is the piece when talking about mobility work that gets very confusing for people. How you apply soft tissue work is variable, right? And depending on the goal you're trying to achieve, the same tool, let's say a foam roller or the balls, right, can be used in so many different ways. You have to define the goal. If I'm going for a parasympathetic response or recovery response for the individual, that is a completely different level of intensity, of duration, of breathing patterns, all while still using the Mobility balls, right? And like we designed and we launched a course that was, 21 days, right? Where we did these 20 minutes that combined dynamic stretching and mobility work. That is a different set of maintenance, movement optimization sort of routines than what we would do to be super targeted to fix a squat, right? Does that make sense, right? Where the application of those tools in that way is for a specific goal. And that goal was maintenance of the body, improvement of overall, right, mobility work, and to help recovery. That's a different emphasis than if we were going to go in and go, okay, you're lacking tibial rotation in your squat. We need to apply an intervention in this to improve your ability to do this thing to then get your squat. Okay, now we're talking about actually creating a sympathetic response where intensity is going to be super high. We're going to use the balls, right, in a very targeted but very low volume way to elicit a nervous system response. And in so doing, we can improve temporarily tibial rotation. Okay, that's step one. That is not the fix though. That is not going to hold forever, right? And this is where a lot of the dumb arguments start coming in, where it's like, oh, well, that didn't hold for 3 days. It's like, well, who said it was supposed to, right? I was going to squat. I had trouble getting in position. I wanted to get into position, right? Totally different application of the tools. High intensity, get an achievable outcome, improve tibial rotation or improve ankle flexion or whatever the goal is, and then put it into the movement that you're trying to do better. Now, the squat is actually the glue that makes that fix, right? Like come together. And this is where it just gets so complicated because, all right, if you're dogmatic about holding to research for this one specific tool and use, well, what about how it's when it's combined with other stuff? What about like that's how you actually do shit in real life, in the clinic, in the gym. You never do these things in isolation where you're like, all right, I'm going to only apply this one tool in this one way, and it's going to achieve all the results. That's insane. It literally makes no sense. We try to do with Mobility, we try to provide clarity and ideas and tools for how to apply specific fixes, right? Whether it be to the athlete or to the coach, that takes some of the noise out of it while recognizing that there's 50 other ways that one could improve tibial rotation.
Yeah.
And this is the root problem, is that like all of these different things work. And so if you want to load the thing to improve it, cool. Did you get the outcome? Great. Love it. Right. Well, guess what? We can do the same thing with the balls and get the outcome. And, what we found through clinical experience is that we can be very efficient and very targeted with that stuff. And that's why we do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with those things for there, and it's a topic that comes up whether we talk about when I've had conversations about nutrition or training, and there's all that research there, but it's just guidelines. It's just a template to work off. Whereas, everything is going to have an effect on other things, and in isolation, in research, everything is controlled. It's a controlled environment. Whereas, in the real world, not everything is going to be as controlled. A little bit like what we started talking about at the start in terms of stress. People might be stressed. People might be sleeping. People might be traveling. There's loads of other things that might be going on, and then putting those strategies into place is like, right, okay, how can we change these things around? And the last bit that you mentioned there in terms of, yes, it might work, but the thing that you mentioned there was being efficient at it. And I think sometimes because, as ultimately, as coaches, we're dictated by the results that we get, and we want it to be a successful result. We don't want to injure the clients or athletes that we're working with. And yes, like what you mentioned, you might be able to load it up and get the end result, but it's a case of that might take a longer time. We might have to go through a longer process. Whereas ultimately, if a strength athletes come in or an endurance athlete's coming in, they want to be able to get back competing, get back to training, get back to working towards their competition or race or whatever it may be. Flip that on its head as a general population client, they just want to be able to, I don't know, pick the son or daughter up without hurting the back, and they don't want to spend ages, working through a process, because this might be a little bit of a tangent, but that's maybe where sometimes clients and athletes can get maybe frustrated with the movement and mobility side of things, that the process is taking too long, and rather than having a more efficient process. Would you agree, or what's your thoughts on that?
I think that's exactly right. I think that the number one limiting factor, right, for coaches is time. And this is true for the individuals that they're coaching. And unfortunately, the reality is that the rest of people's lives is really crappy when it comes to movement quality, right? And it is the cause for most of the issues that they experience in the gym, right? And then the 3 hours that they're in the gym in the week, they're trying to fit in the fixes for the 50 hours they're at the desk, the stress, like there's too much expectation, there's too many goals layered onto that very limited time period, and that is really hard, right? And so that's to bring constantly back right to the thing is being honest about what the goals are, honest about what the limitations are, can actually be really useful, because this is where homework outside of the gym comes in. This is where, like, hacking your posture and like all of these other things become things that, like, the coach should be talking to their clients about. Because if you have to spend every session spending 30 minutes just to get them into a good position to create power from so they don't hurt themselves, well, guess what? Your problem isn't in the gym. Like, your problem is outside of it. And there has to be some consideration made towards that. Most of what we talk about with clients is that, right? Like, it's, I don't need you doing 1,000 corrective exercises. If you need to do 1,000 corrective exercises, you've got a much bigger problem. That problem is the rest of your life. Like, and that's the trap that we fall into all the time, right? Is that this goes back to, if I do an assessment program, I'm going to see a lot of stuff wrong with people, right? Most of those things are not the job of the coach to have to improve every session. It should be that overall movement equality should be improved throughout life, at home, at work, and stuff like that. The more you do that, guess what? The demand and need for doing that in training becomes less. Now I can, in 10 minutes, do the 1 to 2 targeted things. That's what the expectation should be. That's where we try to be honest with people about. If I'm finding 15 things wrong with you, right? Yes, I could apply a mobility solution to every single one of those things, right? And a stability solution. Like, of course, we can talk about that, right? Where there's no separating these two concepts. It's silly to even think, right? Like, all mobility solutions are stability solutions. All stability solutions are mobility solutions, right? You cannot have one without the other. The argument is a dumb argument, right? When people are saying, oh, I just stretch this or mobile. It's like, it always has to go together. It's the way the nervous system works. You're able to achieve and hold range of motion improvements because of the ability to stabilize that, right? And then strengthen that, right? So I just wanted to touch on that real quick, because people get confused about that. When I'm saying mobility, I mean the integration of stability and mobility work. And whenever we are teaching or doing something, let's say we're using the ball on, glute medius, right? Or something like that to open up the hips. Half of the cueing is for bracing and creating sympathetic response and stability while doing that thing, because you're just trying to train the nervous system, right? And that's when we say you can be more efficient with time. It's because you're doing many things at once, right? That's a good use of your prep time. Okay. I'm signaling for waking up the lats, for bracing, right? For all this stuff, while I'm also trying to achieve this very specific, range of motion improvement before I load the thing. And if you're having to do more than 10 minutes of that, the reality is is that you need to have a hard look in the mirror in terms of what the hell are you doing outside of the gym, right? And they need to do something to address that. Our society is not normal. Like, there is no indigenous society on the planet that if you put them into our day-to-day lives would think we're not insane, right? From the level of stimuli that like is constantly bombarding us to the positions that we stick ourselves in. And then we all have this expectation that somehow the body should just be able to like go do all this stuff without these interventions. That's true if we were doing anything remotely normal with our bodies for the vast majority of our time, which we are not. That's the ultimate problem. Like, the ultimate sticking point is that 60 hours a week, people doing shit stuff, right? Sitting at their desk, stressed out, eating crap, all these things. And they're trying to make up for it with 3 hours of training in the week.
Yeah. Do
You
you
can't
know what?
fucking
I
do it.
actually had that I had that conversation with a client who she's suffering with just lower back discomfort. And we've given her the exercises. These are the big rocks that we're going to focus on. But then it's a case of, how much have you moved today? Have you gone for a walk? Have you done any other movement? Which doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to actually be anything crazy that we're doing. Just getting up and moving a little bit, going for a walk, will help with things. Whereas, if we do 1 hour of movement and then the other 23 hours of the day we're not moving, the odds are always going to be in I sound like a Hunger Games commentator or something like that, like, the odds are in the favor of the not moving, and it's going to be hard to be able to grease that groove of that movement and be able to work on it, because it's it's going to be hard to change that all the time. And when we're talking about that, because I think that is a good point in terms of, because I know it sounds daft, but giving people homework is like, right, this is what I want you to focus on. The more that we can focus on that, think of it like unlocking levels on a game. The more our movement improves, we can unlock certain exercises. And that goes back to what we said earlier on about it's got to be fun. People will get bored doing movement exercises all the time. They're supposed to complement our main exercises. And when we're talking about those exercises, there's stretching, there's just body weight movement exercises, but then also there's the tools that we can use. You've mentioned, the foam rollers and the balls and the other tools that we can use. What's kind of it's kind of like a chicken or the egg thing, but what comes first? Can we make a lot of progress by just stretching and body weight stuff? When do we need to implement the other tools and products that we can use? And can sometimes people become maybe too dependent on the tools rather than thinking about how do we best incorporate that to then progress in our movement? Does that make sense?
The answer to that is yes and yes, right? Like, the use for tools, right, in terms of fixing movement quality has a lot to do with efficiency. It has a lot to do with I can introduce a level of stimuli that will have a response that is a fast one. And then I can build on that with movement, right? So the way we always progress things, right, is that Acumen Mobility stands for assess, correct, unify. That's literally what Acumen Mobility is. And that's our process, right? We assess a thing, we find the one or two most important components of that thing that could be improved to create an effect in the end goal, right? That's what the assessments are for, right? It's not to solve all the problems, it's to find the 1 to 2 things. And if you can put your mind into that mindset, right, it allows you to just be more specific. So we go, okay, what are the 2 highest priority things that we need to fix for this guy? That's it. That's all you're trying to fix, right? You're not trying to fix everything, right? So that's the assessments. Then the corrective stuff, there is so many options for correctives, right? You can use bands, and people do balloons for breathing stuff. Like when I say that the options are endless, I mean they're endless. And guess what? There are nuggets of good stuff in every one of those, right? And this is where I think the dogma and holding too tightly to one tool or one thing is a problem. I believe that you want to think of it as, I got this big toolbox, right? What is the most efficient tool? Should I pull out the wrench for this, right? Or should I pull out the hammer? What's the tool for this problem with this time requirement that would be the most efficient? And a lot of times, if we're talking about a range of motion improvement or a mobility thing, pulling out the Acumen Mobility ball, pulling out a roller or something like that is a more efficient use because I can get the intensity up. I can create a stimuli, right, that's very high to create a nervous system response. And that's really the achievable goal. But the moment after you get that, you need to layer in a movement, right, component to that, right? Whether that be a dynamic stretch, whether it be the load pattern, whether it be mimicking the position you're trying to get the person into, right? And this is where the coaches can really pull out a lot of their unique and favorite sort of like correctives, right? But if we're talking about like the raw, like I got 10 minutes, I want to fix this thing, that's where like the tools are super handy, because you go, okay, I know I can get a stimuli in here, then I do my movement part, right? So that's the order we do it, right? Now, that being said, if I wanted to spend a longer period of time or load it a different way, you can achieve tibial rotation improvements without pulling out a soft tissue tool. Of course you can, right? Just a different tool set. And this is the thing, right? Like every coach should have a broad tool set that they know, right? Okay, here's my efficient tool for this. And I find that this is like my go-to, right? But then if that doesn't work, here's my next go-to, right? Because guess what? Even let's say applying the balls for, tib anterior work or something like that, 9 times out of 10, like that's the first thing I'm going to do. But there's always that one time out of 10 where you're like, well, that didn't do like that didn't change anything I wanted. Well, you need to then go, all right, let's jump to the movement solution. Right, like the bigger your tool set, the more flexibility you can have in terms of what do you pull out, right? And we really try to emphasize this. Do not be attached to an individual tool, no matter what it is, right? In your fixes. You can get to the end goal many different ways. A lot of it is efficiency, and a lot of it is kind of in the moment, what is going to be the most applicable tool. For us, we find very often it is to start the process using soft tissue like stimulation of some kind. But that being said, either if you had more time, if you had a different context, like all those things, cool, right? Like half of my workouts, like I don't do any soft tissue work before I do it, right? Like I'm just doing all body weight warm-ups. I mean, like all these things, like great. But if I'm going to go get into the bar and I'm going to go crush like a squat that day, and I know I've always got this nagging right side, adductor mobility problem, guess what I'm hitting it with? Hit it with the balls. Then I'm doing my dynamic search. Then I'm getting under the bar. And in 10 minutes, I can get down to that position way better. I'd have to spend 30 minutes of other prep work to get there. Does that make sense? Right?
Absolutely.
It's all good. It's efficiency. And that's how we think about it, right? Apply the most efficient tool to get the job done, move on and get to the workout, get to the thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. And it's been kind of a common theme as we've spoken through this chat of efficiency. And one thing that I think, which you worded really well, was we can increase the intensity by using the tools, because we've said before, you literally just summed it up there, and it feels as though it's like you've listened into conversations that I've had with clients. The goal is we want to get to training. We don't want to spend, because more often than not, people are coming in for sessions with coaches for an hour and a half.
And that's it.
We want to spend that entire time training, focusing on technique. How can we improve, and getting a training stimulus so we can get stronger, run faster, be more powerful, whatever it may be. And using those tools, because some people say, I know there's the thing of foam rolling. Does it work? Does it not work? How long we should be foam rolling for? Whereas actually within that instance, we can work on that. The stretches, we can work on that. Some of the other tools, we can work on that, just to increase that intensity for a little bit, so that it allows us to then go into performance. So yeah, I thought how we spoke to round everything up from what we've chatted about there, I thought that was a good way to speak about it, because I know at the start speaking about what is actually movement, what's the first port of call, but then equally, we don't train just to do movement or corrective exercises. We train to get stronger, put muscle on, or whatever it may be. And I think that sometimes, especially for someone as yourself, with the experience and the knowledge that you've got around movement and mobility, that is still to then complement still the training that we're doing. You know, it's not that side of it. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Like that is the key differentiator and the key point to make, right? All of these things, whatever it is that is your favorite go-to, right, tool, is to complement to get you to be able to do the thing, i.e., the goal that you're trying to achieve. And sometimes we flip that script, right? And then people are super confused, right? Like you could roll on a foam roller for an hour, right? Like people do. And this is where the confusion of like, does it work, does it not work comes in. Yet again, it's what's the goal, right? If you're gonna roll a foam roller for an hour, you're getting lymph movement, you're getting blood flow movement. Depending on how you're doing it, you're probably getting some nice parasympathetic, right, relaxation. Those are great, right? Like it's just that, did that help you squat better if the squat was the goal, right? And this is where people get confused, and this is where we really emphasize in you know, I think we've done a pretty good job, two of us, of like bringing it back to this. Define the goal first, right? Most of the stuff that we do with IQ Mobility is what we call active mobility work, right, versus passive mobility work. And passive, the way you would define that is passive mobility work is you're just lying on a table and somebody's doing massage to you, right? You're just rolling on the foam roller, right? Maybe you're holding some nice static stretches. That's freaking great, right? There's no problem with that. And I don't think that needs to be demonized or like, you know, I think it just needs to be recognized for what it is, right? Like that is a nice recovery thing to do, that it does what it does, right? But if I want to improve movement quality, right, I need to now train the nervous system into it. I need to incorporate signaling of bracing, of stability, of contraction and release. And this is what all of our exercises do, right? If we're working to improve a range of motion, we are incorporating actively, right, multiple components to get a nervous system response. The tools are just another way of creating that response, yet again, in the most efficient way possible. So if I'm working tib rotation, guess what? While I'm doing it, right, I'm actively working that muscle through its range of motion. I'm actively challenging it. Then immediately I'm going to go plant that foot on the ground and fire the arch and, right, make it do the thing that I just told it, hey, you're allowed to get into this position. And then I'm going to load it. That is a completely different application, right, of soft tissue mobility work than if I just rolled the calf, right, and kind of chatted with my mates like before, you know, before lifting. Yeah. One should know the difference and one should apply the tools accordingly. And I hope that like people come to recognize that, right? That like how you apply the thing is just as important as the thing. And Duffin and I talk about this all the time, right? Like, you know, how you do it is really the key thing. Because if I get on the ball and I just kind of like lazily like work out my trap, you know, cool. But did I do anything to like prep for my bench? You know,
Yeah.
Not really. You know, and you want to take that into account if you really want to get the most out of your prep work.
Yeah, definitely. It's that thing, isn't it? You know, there's sometimes just going through the motions, just doing it because, oh, I saw this post and I have to foam roll. I've got to stretch this off because I'm sat down all day. Whereas, you know, there's a process of doing things, and yeah, not to sort of reuse that word again, but there's a more efficient way of doing things rather than just lying on the foam roller and not doing anything.
Totally. You can burn 20 minutes real quick doing that.
Yeah, definitely. I know obviously quite a lot of topics and tangents thrown in there as well, and a lot of good sort of pearls of wisdom there, and we rounded off quite nicely. But the last question that I always like to ask is, from everything that we've chatted about there, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom for lifters or clients or athletes listening, but also for any coaches listening out there as well?
I think it's similar advice, right? But you'd have to break it into the two categories, right? So for coaches, it goes back to some of our early conversation about like having frank conversations with the client to really understand the goals and then the impediments outside of the gym, right, that would be affecting those goals, so that all of the emphasis isn't on the few hours a week that's there, as though that can fix or should fix all of those problems, right? Because the more clarity you can bring to that, the easier it is for the client to understand the context by which, when they show up, what are they trying to work on and achieve? And you should come up with those together, right? And the more experience the coach has, the more nuance and the more maybe they can get into some other components of that guy's life, right? Like that's the art part of it. And I think that never ends. It doesn't matter how many years you've been doing it. It doesn't, like every client, every person has like a different story, a different need, a different goal. And I think that's where being loose with dogma is really important. And then have a framework by which you can very quickly get the information you need to create a positive change for that day. And that's all you try to achieve with that session, right? And I think if you did that, ironically, most of the time people actually end up achieving more than if they try to fix everything, right? And so my advice to coaches is don't try to fix everything, right? And not everything needs to be fixed, and knowing the difference is really important, right? More so, find the one or two things that you can work on that day that makes the goal better. If you do that and nothing else, you're a success, right? Guy's gonna be happy, you're gonna be happy, good workout, you can build on it. Next time, all right, does he have to work on that thing again? Okay, you're gonna work on it again if it's the most important thing. Or maybe he's resolved it, move on to the next thing. If you just treat your clients and your training as an iterative process, that every week and every time you come in, you can quickly gather some information. This is why we always like quick assessments versus like super in-depth ones. Like in 1 minute, I can run you through 10 assessments and go, okay, what's going on today? Oh man, you're super stressed. Oh wow, shit, what the hell's going on with that shoulder, right? And then do the one or two targeted things. If you do that every time, guess what? Over time, you've made a massive improvement in that guy's movement quality and his ability to work out, right? And you've avoided a lot of the pitfalls of, that guy often gets hurt because you didn't know a thing was going on that day, right? Because of something that was happening outside of the gym.
Yeah.
That's how we treat assessments for a training process, which is different, by the way. And it'll be a whole different podcast to talk about how do we treat assessments for fixing pain, right? Fixing orthopedic, those are different categories, right? And if you have that, while some of the rules are the same, some of the application of tools are the same, how you approach it is very different. The level of work is very different. The progressions are very different. And we try to break them into two categories. Which leads to your second question. What does the individual do? Well, same thing as what the coach does. And I don't know if you're asking the question for if you don't have a coach, what does the individual do? But let's take that example. This is also where an understanding of some higher like order of priority, right? In terms of, well, what do you need to be the fundamentals for your movement, and a quick assessment process can also get the individual a lot of clarity in terms of all the noise and all the confusion about what they should be doing at home or doing in their own workouts. Because you can see 1,000 Instagram videos, right, that are all awesome, right? But they might not apply to you. How do you know? And that's what we try to do. You look at our blogs, you look at different things where we break out specific problems. That's what we're doing, is we're showing, okay, for this movement, here's the couple most important, positional requirements. Go check yourself. Go look like at home. Break them out and go, oh man, I didn't know that like my right adductor is, my adductor flop is terrible on this side. No wonder I can't get into like my squat position. Cool. Now you got something to work on, right? Versus trying to work on everything and be super overwhelmed by all the incoming information. We live in a weird age where there is every single thing, every secret, every single thing you could ever want to know is all publicly available, right? And it's all on Instagram or YouTube or something like that. But there's no wisdom attached to it. So it's super overwhelming. It's super confusing, right?
Yeah.
And that's the hard part. So try to provide a little clarity, follow simple rules, start with that, build on it. Doesn't have to be rocket science.
Some really good points to finish off there. And I know for me, cleared up a lot of things that, you get asked by clients, you get asked by other coaches. And I think that was a good way to round everything off there. Thanks a lot, Brad, for taking the time to jump on. Really, really enjoyed chatting with you and picking your brains. For everyone listening who might have any questions about what we've chatted about today, see the products that you put out there, the information and content you put out there as well, where can people find that and reach out to you?
The two best places would be either the website, acumobility.com. We've got educational videos that show how to use the products and work different body parts. So there's in-depth videos in there. And then our Instagram page, my wife runs that, and we're constantly putting out education materials. That's what we use the page for, right? Is here's how to fix different issues. Here's how to use the tools. Here's how to understand specific movement problems. And if you go through that, you'll find lots of examples and in-depth gems, right, for how to work all sorts of different things. And so those would probably be the two places. In terms of getting the products, if you're in the UK, it'd be on Amazon.
Yeah.
Amazon UK, or if you're in Europe, it'd be on Amazon.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Brad, for taking the time to jump on. 100% for everyone listening. Look at the content and information out there. It's really useful. And, remember, have a look at it and, think, is that going to be specific for you? Is that going to be right for you, especially from the topics that we've just spoken about, in this episode? So thanks again, Brad. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will catch up with you all next week.
Sounds good. Thank you.